So once again, everybody, welcome to part 2 of our lecture series on the elements of historical theory. Let's dive right in. So the next element of historical theory I want to discuss with you is what is known as the cultural conflict model. Now before we get into the specifics of this particular element, we need to kind of define what we mean by culture and also what we mean by civilization when we use that term. Now, culture can generally be defined as a people with a similar lifestyle, similar values, and key, the same language. Now, sort of piggybacking off of that is this idea of civilization. Now, fundamentally, civilization must have an urban characteristic to it. The development of towns and cities is key to the foundation of any civilization. And this includes institutions such as government, churches, schools, marriage, things of that nature. Written language is absolutely key to the development of civilization as we understand it. A way to communicate, a way to keep records, a way to record history. Now, civilization may be multicultural. The acceptance of people's different lifestyles within the same society. And this culture can maintain itself in a multicultural milieu through common spoken and written language. One of the reasons why I said earlier that language is key to this development and establishment and maintenance of culture as we understand it. Now, if part of a culture begins to change, subcultures may develop. Now, subcultures threaten the integrity of that larger culture, and often that larger culture may seek to eradicate that subculture within it. Now, for the real nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts of the cultural conflict model. And really, it's encompassed in this idea of the conflict between what we term inferior and superior cultures. Inferior culture is generally less advanced or less developed than superior culture. Now, this does not in any way imply that one is better or worse than the other from a moral or ethical standpoint. It's simply referring to the relative level of advancement or development between the two. Now, when inferior culture meets a superior culture, friction often occurs. When friction occurs, 4 different things may happen. The first, elimination. The inferior culture is eliminated by the superior culture. Now, vestiges of that inferior culture may remain in place names. An example of that is, many of the towns, many of the mountains, rivers, etc., that are here in eastern North Carolina or North Carolina in general have American Indian place names. But for the most part, those cultures no longer exist within those particular areas. Second, assimilation. The inferior culture is assimilated into the superior culture. The superior culture has basically taken that inferior culture, and the peoples of that inferior culture have become assimilated within the superior culture. They have taken on that superior culture's characteristics, and the majority of the characteristics of their previous culture no longer exist or no longer manifest on a day-to-day basis. Third, amalgamation. The inferior culture and the superior culture fuse to form a new culture. And last, what we term a pocket culture. The inferior culture remains within the larger milieu of that superior culture, but becomes sort of a pocket within it. It's allowed to survive and protected by that superior culture. An example of this would be Indian reservations, the Amish communities up in Pennsylvania, or even like the Mennonite communities that exist right here in eastern North Carolina. Now, if two cultures are at approximately the same developmental level, both can remain, but continued conflict exists. The next element of historical theory I want to discuss is short and sweet. It's called cultural divergence. If a people within the same culture are separated from their original culture by distance and time, those people gradually evolve into a separate culture. It is the tendency of an isolated segment of a culture to change over time. Removed from the influence of the parent culture, if you will, a new culture develops that has many of the characteristics of that parent culture, but is altered to a degree enough to be separate now from that original culture. The third one I want to discuss in this particular presentation is called the nature of power. Fundamentally, all political power is derived from the people. Yes, even in autocratic or monarchical regimes. Generally, when they talk about this idea of the power of the people, people think in terms of democratic or republican sorts of situations. And when I say democratic or republican, I don't mean with the capital D or the capital R, those define political parties. I mean in the ideas of democracy or republicanism, which we will be talking about at length over the course of this particular class. But what I mean by this sort of political power held by the people existing within even autocratic or monarchical regimes is that fundamentally those in power can only remain in power through the acquiescence, through the will of the people they control. Even kings or dictators are subject to this. You know, while in democratic or republican societies, people can use those political tools that are inherent in those societies to call the people in power to account for their actions or inactions, if you will. In autocratic or monarchical regimes, that still exists, but instead of using the tools of political power, they use the tools of social reinforcement, or at worst, rebellion and revolution to achieve the change against that which they are being oppressed by or upset with, if you will. Now, people relinquish some of their power to government in exchange for protection services. You know, we kind of alluded to this earlier when we were talking about the fundamental reason that governments are formed when we discussed the three drivers of humanity in the previous lecture on the elements of historical theory. This is where this really comes more into light here. Now, even though governments are formed for the express purpose of the protections of the societies that they govern, people can always revolt or rebel if they are unhappy or unsatisfied. Thus, again, as I alluded to before, the needs and desires of people must be taken into account by those holding power, or they risk losing that power. So, fundamentally, the power of the people is stronger than the people in power. Next, I want to talk about the social compact. Now, people naturally desire government for security, specifically the security of property, both physical and the self. People create government to meet their needs. And the relationship between government and people is reciprocal. Government requires allegiance, including such things as taxes, from the people in exchange for the protection that the government provides to the people. Now, all governments, and other institutions for that matter, tend to become corrupt over time. What I mean by this is that the ideals that establish those governments in the beginning tend to lose power as the generation that established that government recedes in public memory, and new generations, not so wedded to those initial ideals, take over. When governments become corrupt, people have the right to petition the government for change. This is fundamental to that idea of the social compact. Now, if governments do not respond to people's desires or needs, people have the responsibility, and some even say are obligated, to overthrow that government and establish a new government that will be responsive to those desires or needs. Now, this idea of the social compact emerged from the period of the Enlightenment in the late 17th and 18th centuries, and thinkers like John Locke, who you see right here, thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that you see right here, and thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, that you see right here. Now, we'll be talking more about these people and their ideas as we move forward in this course.